Hello, human sexuality. How are you this fine day, evening, night, or whenever you happen to be watching this video? We've made it through the midterm, and now we're on to Module 8. And I just wanted to take some time and sort of give you a kind of basis going in, because Module 8, about other kinds of sexual activities, or paraphilias, if you will, often it needs a little bit of explanation in order to really get a grip of what the chapter is about and what the module is about. And one of the reasons for this is that there's a lot of misconceptions about what paraphilic activity might mean. We assume it's well, sometimes we assume it's always something negative, and sometimes it is something negative, but not all paraphilic behavior is bad or wrong or deviant, although deviance has always been part of the definition, as we'll find out. Anyway, let's just jump in, and I'll start maybe with a few things you might have heard about in the news to kind of whet our appetite here. Some of you may have heard about this recent, well, first it was a best-selling trilogy of books. Now it's a best-selling movie. It's certainly a phenomenon to be reckoned with. According to some researchers, it's the biggest publishing phenomenon since Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. It sold over 1 million copies in record time and topped best-selling charts. And it's basically a book about a young graduate, Anastasia Steele, who meets a dashing millionaire called Christian Grey, and they enter into a very different kind of sexual relationship, and they also fall in love. And this book, this series of books, this movie, has really turned the world on its ear in terms of what counts as real sex, the kinds of things people can do sexually. As you might notice from the pictures of the covers, there's a lot of bondage involved, some pain, some humiliation, a lot of kinky sex, and it's really changed how many people think about sexual alternatives. Now, it's not the best book in the world in terms of how to do sadomasochism, and you might find that if you talk to anybody who is actually in a sadomasochistic community, we'll get to that later, but it certainly spawned lots of controversy. In the picture I'm showing you here, this woman and her group, who referred to 50 Shades of Grey as 50 Shades of Abuse, where women are being victimized and it's just wrong, they actually volunteered, ran a publicity stunt where they actually turned the books into compost and toilet paper. So whether you think 50 Shades of Grey is a new way to think about sex or sexual activity, it's a fun kind of way to play, or it's a poor representation of what sadomasochism has to offer, it's certainly part of our paraphilic reality in today's day and age. Now, if you want to talk controversy, I first heard about this organization on South Park, and since it has been on The Simpsons, I thought it was just a joke about the perversity of society. It turns out that the North American Man-Boy Love Association is a real association, and they have an actual website that you can go to, and let me just tell you a little bit about them here. One sec. So here it is, the NAMBLA Association. They call themselves the North American Man-Boy Love Association, and it was formed in 1978. Their goal is to end the extreme oppression of men and boys in mutually consensual relationships by building understanding and support for such relationships, educating the general public on the benevolent nature of man-boy love, and onward and onward. I have to confess that your professor doesn't really understand this and thinks that it's well, any kind of pedophilia, no matter what they call themselves, is anytime there's a power imbalance in a relationship with an adult and a child, a sexual relationship, even if the child, who is really not of an age to consent, says yes, that can still have lasting damage. Nevertheless, this does exist, and it's out there as part of our reality. Is all paraphilia about pedophilia? No, but it's part of our daily reality. And then, of course, there are some of you who might remember a few years back, 2013, when around this part of the city, around St. Mary's and Dalhousie, there was the sleepwatcher. Remember him? It's been a while since any new sleepwatching incidents have been reported in the south end of Halifax, but according to recent posts, the file is still open. And it was this man breaking into women's houses and watching them sleep. Now, some might suggest that this is a part of an obsession with being sexually aroused, somnophilia, being sexually aroused by watching someone sleep without their knowledge. The thing is, it's also without their consent. And as we learn, just as with NAMLA, consent and age of consent and all these things are very important, and when they're violated, any kind of violation of that is a crime. And one of the things that scared people so much about the sleepwatcher was that often this kind of behavior escalates, that first it's enough just to watch, and then he might try to touch them or do something like that. It's been a few years since this has happened, and they did arrest someone. But it's certainly, again, one of the negative things we might associate with paraphilia is this people being sexually turned on by taking things which are not theirs and breaking into someone's house and basically threatening their safety and their sense of security. So I'm not sure if you'll but you probably do remember this one, Jian Ghomeshi. Recently, his case has gone to trial. I haven't heard about it in the news just in the last couple of weeks. You may have heard about it in the news. And his defense is that he has a very specific kind of sexual appetite, and that the people that he hit or strangled or physically abused were into that kind of sexual relationship. Now, I'll leave it up to the courts to tell the difference, but it brings up the real kind of paraphilia where people are aroused by consensual sadomasochistic sex, and some are only turned on by violating another person's consent. That's two different things. There's consensual, where the person agrees to be hit or hurt or humiliated or strangled or attacked, and then there's the other part of that where you're turned on by violating another person's consent. You don't ask for those things. You don't explicitly explain that this is what you want to be part of your sexual activity, and in that case, it's taking it without consent. And if Jian Ghomeshi is in fact found guilty of that, hopefully he'll be sentenced and sent to prison. So just so you know that there's a lot of, it brings up a lot of interesting questions. What is paraphilia? So probably a central issue of this module and this discussion is, we had the module on sort of common or normal, quote-unquote, sex behaviors, this is the chapter on unusual sexual behaviors, also known as paraphilias. But it brings us to a central issue. What is normal? At one time, masturbation was considered abnormal or strange or unusual or paraphilic because the normal place of sexual activity was in the marriage bed, and the normal purpose of sexual activity was, of course, to beget children, or begat. Other issues that are going to come up with this, with paraphilia, is paraphilic sex abnormal? When does abnormality become a moral issue? So, as you may have already gathered, some of the things we've talked about are clearly immoral, and not only that, but illegal. And anytime you take anything without that person's express consent or knowledge or permission, then you're bordering on the illegal and the amoral. Or immoral, sorry. And a lot of it revolves around this idea of whether it's consensual or non-consensual, or coercive or non-coercive. So if you're playing out a sadomasochism scene where one person is tying up or handcuffing another, or even using pain, if both have agreed to that from the very beginning, and they've set out rules about safety and safe words, and they've negotiated all those issues, that's consensual, and it's not immoral, and it's not illegal. However, if you take any of that for granted, or just spring that on someone without discussing it first, then you risk being coercive and entering into the area of non-consent and illegality. So you can see this is one of those modules that you kind of have to pay attention to, because a lot of things fall under the umbrella of paraphilic activity, and yet some of it's legal, some of it isn't. So it's something to keep in mind as you're going through this. So I wanted to just take some time and go over a few goals with this module. First is to find out what sexual behaviors are considered atypical. So masturbation no longer falls in this chapter, whereas if it was at the beginning of the 1900s, it definitely would fall in this chapter. In fact, we'll find out about a textbook, or a sex book, if you will, where it does just that. Also, I want you to consider that some expressions of certain paraphilic behaviors can be a part of a healthy sex life. For instance, when we talk about fetishes, if they disrupt your ability to relate to people, or they're too intense, well, of course, that becomes a problem. But if someone has a foot fetish, that might just mean they like to make love to someone wearing socks, or they like to make love to someone wearing high heels, or it might not have anything to do with making love, but more like having sex. There's a variety of behaviors there. Also, during this module, you'll learn about theories that try to explain how paraphilias develop. In fact, one of our mini modules is all about that. And you'll find out about the various approaches to treating harmful paraphilias as you read through the textbook. Hopefully, during this module, you'll have something to think about, and certainly something to talk about in the discussions. Now, as I just mentioned, in our textbook, masturbation, even oral sex, falls under the category of normal or more typical sexual behaviors. But in early textbooks, in fact, the earliest one written by this man here, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, masturbation and any other behavior besides sort of sexual behavior for the purpose of procreation might be considered paraphilic. But there were also some behaviors back then that were kind of weird. Richard von Krafft-Ebing was the first to write a detailed account of paraphilic behaviors in a medical text called Psychopathia Sexualis that he published in 1886. And in that book, there's 237 case studies of some of the kinds of sexual activities you might find. discussed later in the module. So I just wanted to give you two examples of paraphilic entries, two of these 237 case studies. And this is from the Hawk text. Well, I'm reading it from the Hawk text, but it's taken from his actual textbook written in 1886. So the first involves a paraphilia called zoophilia or zoophilia, which is an attraction to animals. Again, issues of consent are huge here, because how do you know an animal is consenting? And, well, I'll read this and you can decide for yourself. In a provincial town, a man was caught having intercourse with a hen. He was 30 years old and of high social position. The chickens had been dying, one after another, and the man causing it had been wanted for a long time. To the question of the judge as to the reason for such an act, the accused said that his genitals were so small that coitus with women was impossible. Medical examination showed that actually the genitals were extremely small. The man was mentally quite sound. There were no statements concerning any abnormalities at the time of puberty. I'm saying it's probably safe to say the chickens didn't consent. Another case is about a type of behavior we now call a fetish. Z began to masturbate at the age of 12. From that time, he could not see a woman's handkerchief without having orgasm and ejaculation. He was irresistibly compelled to possess himself of it. At that time, he was a choir boy and used the handkerchiefs to masturbate within the bell tower close to the choir. But he chose only such handkerchiefs as had black and white borders or violet stripes running through them. At age 15, he had coitus. Later on, he married. As a rule, he was potent only when he wound such a handkerchief around his penis. Often he preferred coitus between the thighs of a woman where he had placed a handkerchief. Wherever he espied a handkerchief, he did not rest until he was in possession of it. He always had a number of them in his pockets and around his penis. Now, this is a slightly different situation. As long as you're not stealing handkerchiefs, then you're not violating any laws. And even back then, it was seen to be unusual and thus paraphilic, but not necessarily coercive or illegal. So Krafft-Ebing's book became the standard for defining and diagnosing sexual pathology. And you have to bear in mind that when he wrote it, this was in the height of the Victorian era, whereas I described before, procreation was only for the purpose of, was the only purpose of sexual desire. There was no other normal reason to have sex. And also, so homosexuality, bisexuality were considered pathological, masturbation, as I mentioned, and women themselves were considered passive. And so there's no cases of women recorded in Psychopathia Sexualis because, for one reason, they weren't considered to have any kind of sex drive, let alone abnormal or paraphilic types of sex drive. And I've just kind of given you a little bit of detail here. So he had 4 categories of cerebral neuroses that his cases fell into. Paradoxia, sexual desire at the wrong time of life. Consider that. What's the wrong time of life? And what's the right time of life? Maybe those reproductive years. Anesthesia, insufficient sexual desire in the context of marriage. Hyperesthesia, excessive sexual desire, and perhaps involving the neighbor's chickens. And paresthesia, misdirected sexual desire, which included homosexuality, bisexuality, sexual fetishism, sadism, masochism, and pedophilia. And I have to say, as a homosexual, to be included in some of those categories is a little disturbing. So I've given you kind of a brief historical background there, just to make us aware of the fact that how we define normal sexual behavior is hugely influenced by whatever the norms of a particular culture or society are at that time and place. So, like I said, nowadays, masturbation is considered a very healthy behavior. It's often part of when sexual therapists are counseling people, it's part of the activities that are recommended in counseling. Helps sleep. We know there's lots of health benefits, right? But there was a time when it was considered strange and unusual. At best, strange or weird, and at worst, a deviant and a terrible waste of human energies. So just to consider that what we consider to be paraphilic now, we might not think of as being paraphilic in the future, or in another time, or another place, or another situation. So keep that in mind when you're going through this module. How are atypical sexual behaviors defined? Well, paraphilia itself is derived from two Greek words. Philia is love, and para is deviation, or in addition to. Like a paramedic is someone who helps the medics at the hospital, right? But there's sort of something added on as a side. So side love is one way to think of it, or devious love. One thing I should caution you to is that paraphilias exist in a continuum ranging from normal to abnormal, and that continuum, as I say, changes in time, from culture to culture, depending on your values, your feelings about sexuality, sometimes your religious feelings. And as we'll find out, just recently in the last version of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Health, they actually moved to make a distinction between those behaviors which are classified or diagnosed as paraphilias, strange love, side love, unusual love, and those behaviors which are classified as paraphilic disorders. And we'll talk more about this in just a second. So as recently as the DSM-4, which was the second to last version that came out, paraphilias were defined as recurring, intensely arousing paraphilic fantasies that lasted for at least 6 months, plus the person had to have acted on those urges or fantasies, and it could be consensual or victimless, or it could be coercive. So if it's just a paraphilia, it's consensual or victimless. In the revision, they wanted, people campaigned to change the definition so that not all paraphilias were considered paraphilic disorders. I'd like to go back here and take out what I just said about this slide here. So starting this again. So based on the DSM-4, paraphilias were defined as recurring, intensely arousing paraphilic fantasies for at least 6 months. The persona or the person has acted on those urges. Both those things had to be present to be diagnosed as a paraphilia. There was an issue about, you could consider whether it was consensual or victimless. If it caused marked distress or interpersonal difficulties, even if it was consensual, it was still considered a paraphilic problem. But that wasn't spelled out as clearly as it was to be spelled out in the next version of the DSM. So for the DSM-5, which was published in 2013, people campaigned to change the definition of paraphilia, specifically that just because you have a paraphilic, you enjoy paraphilic behavior and practice it for 6 months, et cetera, it doesn't mean that you're actually suffering from a disorder. So, because the implication there is that there's some kind of mental illness involved. So you can see why people were kind of keen to change the definition. If you are sexually turned on by someone who wears heels and kind of need that in order to get orgasm, that doesn't mean that you have a mental disorder. It just means you have what, by our societal standards, is considered an unusual sexual behavior. So they wanted to make the distinction that paraphilic disorders are paraphilias that cause distress or impairment either to the individual themselves or to other people. And if it causes distress or impairment to other people, that's where consensual and whether it's consensual, non-consensual comes into play. If you're wondering what that noise is in the background, my cat is trying to help me record this evening, which is very helpful. So if you want to go back a little bit in time, for the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, there has been a history of some behaviors being considered mental illness that perhaps now we know are not mental illness. For instance, homosexuality was officially characterized as a mental disorder in 1952, and it wasn't until 1973 that homosexuality in general was removed, and then it was replaced with something called ego-dystonic homosexuality. So then it wasn't considered a disorder unless it caused the person interpersonal or personal suffering. But you can imagine that if you're being persecuted or your family disowns you because you're gay, that might cause you personal suffering, and yet still not mean that you are mentally ill. So then by 1987, all forms of homosexuality were removed from the DSM. So we can see some of this happening with paraphilias versus paraphilic disorders. So by 1980, again, the DSM-3, the term paraphilia is used to describe sex kink disorders. So it's assumed that if you have a paraphilia, that you are suffering from some kind of disorder, and the implication is that you have some kind of mental illness or distortion. Before the DSM-3, the umbrella category sexual deviations was used, and that included homosexuality, masochism, sadism, transvestism, fetishism, and other consensual minority sexualities that were listed alongside criminal kinds of pedophilia, criminal types of paraphilia like pedophilia and frauderism. And if you're thinking, I don't know what those mean, you want to find out what those mean as you're going through the module, and hopefully you'll have lots of opportunities to do that. So again, a movement to change this was in the recently released DSM-5, made a distinction between paraphilias and paraphilic disorders. And here's the paper that they used that was submitted to the committee that was determining these changes, and these changes were accepted. So this paper was presented at the 19th World Congress for Sexual Health and became the basis of the changes to how paraphilias and paraphilic disorders are considered in the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. So they proposed that the term paraphilia would denote any intense and persistent sexual interest other than sexual interest in genital stimulation or preparatory fondling, or what we might call foreplay, with phenotypically normal consenting adult human partners. You might be wondering what a phenotypically normal partner is. Well, consider for a moment, there are some people who are only attracted to people who have a visible physical disability. Now, that doesn't mean if your partner has a physical, visible disability that you're one of those people. But if you only have ever dated people who, say, are missing a limb or are in a wheelchair, and you're only physically attracted to those people, then you might fall under this paraphilic classification. But in general, the term paraphilia is any intense and persistent sexual interest other than what has classically been considered normal or typical sexual interest. And they said, that's fine, we'll define it that way. But there should be classifications under the definition. So, for instance, not paraphilic, they want it to be very clear. Cunnilingus, you know what that means. Fellatio, anal penetration with the finger, penis or dildo, analingus, intracrural intercourse, rubbing against one's thighs, or using the thighs to stimulate the penis. Cross-masturbation, that's masturbating each other, kissing and fondling. While these are all sort of considered not necessary to reproduction, or perhaps something that is different than the traditional missionary position of coitus, it's not considered paraphilic, because it still falls under the category of usual sexual behaviors. So, paraphilic then would include such things as being sexually turned on by enemas, being sexually turned on by feces or urine, generalized sexual interest into amputees, paralyzed persons, physical deformities, bondage, whipping, cutting, asphyxiation, sneezing or smoking persons, or obscene telephone calls. Now again, if you have a slightly unusual sexual appetite, this might seem, this global definition of paraphilic and some of the things associated with it might alarm you a little bit. So they wanted to clarify this a bit more. So this is what they do. So they said there needs to be a distinction in the manual which clinicians use to diagnose people between paraphilic behaviors or sexual appetites and paraphilic disorders. One is just something that's not quite usual by today's standards, and the other is something that involves either coercion or personal harm or some kind of violation of consent. So there are two criteria to distinguish between a paraphilia and a paraphilic disorder. Criterion A specifies the qualitative nature of the disorder. So it has to happen a lot. That's quantitative. But it needs to be unusual sexualized interest or behavior. That's the quality of the sexual behavior. Criterion B specifies the negative consequence of the behavior. So if you have a handkerchief fetish, but it doesn't cause you personal distress and you're not stealing them from others, then it wouldn't be a paraphilic disorder under the latest classification system. However, if you are stealing from others or it causes you great distress, or you find that without, it interferes with your interpersonal relationships, then if it harms you, in that case it would harm you, then you would meet criteria B. Both criteria must exist together to diagnose a paraphilic disorder. So again, you have a foot fetish or any kind of sexual interest that, while unusual, doesn't involve taking things from people without their consent, doesn't harm others, and doesn't cause distress to yourself, then you don't meet the criteria for a paraphilic disorder because you don't meet criterion B. And finally, the last thing that you may have heard me mention already, again, if a paraphilia is coercive or victimizing, that would meet criterion B in the DSM-5. And it's also a really big consideration as to whether a paraphilia should be considered immoral or illegal. And if it involves unsuspecting, non-consenting, or unwilling person as a sexual target. So if you're only sexually turned on by forcing yourself upon someone without their consent, well, that's sexual assault, right? That's rape. Or you may not actually physically hurt the person or attack the person or assault the person if you're someone who uses binoculars to watch your neighbor undress and get sexually turned on by that. You are taking something without that person's consent, just like the sleepwatcher standing in people's bedroom was taking something without those women's consent. That's coercive and victimizing, and coincidentally would be grounds for being diagnosed with a paraphilic disorder. However, there are many paraphilias which are non-victimizing. Anyway, hopefully I've stimulated your interest in this chapter, and I just hope that you go in with an open mind, and you know that not all paraphilias are illegal, and not all paraphilias are paraphilic disorders, and that human sexual behavior is as unusual or as deviant or as nuanced as any kind of human behavior, and that's not always bad. Enjoy the module. I'll talk to you in the next module. See you next week. Bye for now.